The ships appeared without warning. One moment, the space above Jupiter was empty, just the usual dark and silence that had been there since the beginning of time. And then, in the span of a single breath, 200 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and filled that darkness with metal and fire and cold, dead light. Each ship was enormous. The smallest one in the fleet was 3 times the size of the largest aircraft carrier ever built on Earth. The biggest ones were so large that they looked less like ships and more like small moons. Gray, brutal, covered in weapon turrets and sensor arrays, and the dull glow of energy cannons charging in their ports. They moved in perfect formation, slow and unhurried. The way something moves when it has never had a reason to rush, when it has never had a reason to fear anything at all. And on board the command ship, a vessel called the Eternal Fist of Zarbek, Grand Admiral Velkos stood at the observation window and looked down at the small blue planet in the distance. He had done this many times before. He had stood at windows like this one, above worlds like that one, and watched what came next. He had seen species kneel. He had seen species beg. He had seen species try to fight, and he had watched them burn. He was not a cruel being by nature. He was simply a professional, and his profession for the last 60 years had been delivering the same message to the same kind of people, over and over again. You are not strong enough. Surrender now, or there will be nothing left of you to surrender. He turned away from the window and walked to his command chair. His officers moved around him in practiced silence, pulling up data on the planet below, running scans, building a tactical picture of what they were dealing with. He already knew what they would find. He had read the intelligence reports on the way here. He knew this species. He knew what they were. They called themselves humans. They lived on a single world, a one world, just one, in a small, unremarkable star system at the edge of a quiet spiral arm of the galaxy. They had not yet developed reliable faster-than-light travel, though their scientists were getting close. They had no colonies on other planets, no military presence beyond their own solar system, and no real unified government to speak of, just a collection of nations and councils and committees that argued with each other constantly. They had been at war with each other for most of their history. They were emotional, erratic, short-lived creatures who averaged less than 100 years of life before they died. In the grand scale of the Zarvekians' galactic empire, which had existed for 12,000 years, which governed 4,000 star systems, which commanded fleets so large that entire civilizations had looked at them and simply given up, the humans were nothing. A footnote. A species that had not yet figured out that the galaxy was not waiting for them. The Imperial Science Division had classified them as a pre-emergent species. That was the official term for a civilization that was just beginning to reach for the stars. It meant they were not a threat. It meant they had no real military power. It meant this mission should take at most a few days. Valkos had been given 200 ships for this. It was, if anything, they more than he needed. But the Emperor liked to make impressions. "Begin the broadcast," he said. One of his officers, a young woman named Ashari, who handled communications, nodded and activated the long-range transmitter. The signal went out on every frequency that human technology could detect. It reached every satellite in orbit, every radio telescope on the ground, every communication system on the planet below. Within minutes, it was playing on every screen and speaker on Earth. The message was translated by the Empire's universal translation software, which had spent the last 14 months quietly studying human languages. There were many of them. The humans had hundreds, but the software had narrowed it down to the most commonly used ones and prepared a version of the message in each. The message was simple. It was always simple. There was no point in making it complicated. People of Earth, you are being contacted by the Zarvekian Galactic Empire. You have been observed developing technology that will soon allow you to travel beyond your star system. Before you do, you must understand your place in this galaxy. The Empire governs all civilized space. All species who wish to exist within that space must submit to imperial authority, pay imperial tribute, and provide imperial service. You have 30 days to formally surrender your world and your people to the Empire. If you comply, your lives will be spared, and you will be integrated into the imperial order. If you do not comply, your world will be destroyed. This message is not a negotiation. It is a courtesy. Then the transmission ended. Valkos leaned back in his command chair and waited. And this was always the part that took a little time. The species below would panic. They would argue. They would look at his fleet and do the math and realize they had no choice. Most of them surrendered within 2 or 3 days. A few held out until the deadline. Occasionally, one of the more stubborn ones tried to fight, and that was always brief and always painful, and always ended the same way. He expected this to be no different. The United Earth Defense Council met 6 hours after the broadcast. They met underground, deep beneath the city of Geneva, in a bunker that had been built for exactly this kind of situation, though most of the people who built it had hoped it would never be used. The room was large and circular, with a long table in the center, and screens covering every wall, meaning around that table sat the most powerful people on Earth: military commanders, heads of state, intelligence directors, scientists, and representatives from every major nation. They had all heard the message. They had all seen the ships on their telescopes and sensors. The numbers were not in dispute. 200 warships, each one larger than anything Earth had ever built, sitting in their solar system with weapons that could crack open the surface of a planet. The room was very quiet when Secretary General Amara Osei walked in. She was a tall woman, calm in the way that only people who have prepared for something for a very long time can be calm. She had been Secretary General of the United Earth Council for 6 years. Before that, she had spent 30 years in Earth's deep space program, not as a scientist, but as its director of strategic planning. She had spent those 30 years thinking about first contact, not the hopeful kind, the other kind. She sat down, looked around the table and said, "Let's hear it." For the next 2 hours she listened. Politicians argued for surrender. The ships were real. The threat was real. There was no point in dying for pride. Generals argued for resistance. Humanity had a right to exist on its own terms, and surrendering to slavery was not survival. Scientists argued about the technology gap. Diplomats argued about the wording of a possible response. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone was afraid. Amara listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she raised her hand, and the room went quiet. "I have one question," she said. "How many ships do they think we have?" The room was silent for a moment. Then the director of Earth's intelligence services, a sharp-eyed man named General Haruto Mori, cleared his throat. "Based on what we know of their surveillance methods," he said carefully, "and the classification they gave us in their own internal files, which our people pulled from their transmission headers, they consider us a pre-emergent species. They have been watching us for 14 months. In that time, they would have detected our early FTL experiments, our civilian space program, and our planetary defense satellites." He paused. "They almost certainly believe we have no warships at all." Another silence. Longer this time. Amara nodded slowly. "Show them." What happened next was not in any imperial database, because 14 months of surveillance was not enough. Not nearly enough. If the Empire scouts had been watching Earth for 100 years, they might have noticed the slow and careful thing that humanity had been building in secret since the middle of the 22nd century. But they had only been watching for 14 months, and in that time, they had seen what humanity wanted the universe to see: a busy, chaotic, squabbling species that was just beginning to reach for space. They had not seen what was on the dark side of the moon. The lunar shipyard complex, officially designated as a deep space construction facility, classified above top secret, was not one shipyard. It was 7, spread across the far side of the lunar surface, hidden from Earth-based observation and shielded from long-range scanning by layers of technology that humanity had spent decades perfecting specifically for this purpose. And Amara, those 7 shipyards were not empty. When General Mori activated the live feed from the moon's surface, the council room went very quiet. Not because anyone was surprised. Most of the people in that room had clearance to know what was there. They went quiet because seeing it on screen, knowing that the Empire was about to see it too, made it feel very real. Row after row of warships in various stages of completion, sleek dark hulls, long predatory shapes, weapon systems that humanity had spent 60 years designing specifically to fight the kind of war that no one publicly admitted they were preparing for. The feed showed one facility, One out of 17 that existed across the solar system, on the moon, in the asteroid belt, in the outer system, and in places that 14 months of Imperial surveillance had never even scanned properly. Transmitted, Amara said. The live feed from the lunar shipyard was packaged and sent back to the Imperial fleet at the edge of the solar system. No words, no message, just the feed. Let them look. On board the Eternal Fist of Zarbek, Grand Admiral Velkos watched the transmission with a frown. It was unusual. In his experience, species in this situation sent back either a formal surrender or a desperate declaration of defiance. They did not send back video footage of construction facilities. He watched the feed carefully. The ships in the yards were smaller than Imperial vessels, much smaller, but there were a lot of them. He counted quickly. His tactical officer was already running the numbers. How many ships visible in this transmission? Velkos asked. Approximately 240, Admiral. At various stages of construction, perhaps 60 to 80 near completion. Velkos studied the ships. They were well built, he had to admit. Clean lines, redundant systems visible even from the outside, engine configurations he didn't recognize, but could appreciate. He was not worried. 200 ships, even 240, was nothing compared to what he had available, and these were clearly not all combat ready. It's a bluff, said his second-in-command, Commander Zathari. They're trying to look more dangerous than they are. Probably, Velkostas agreed, but noted, we'll revise our assessment if necessary. He turned back to the window. 30 days. The deadline stood. He was not concerned. But in a corner of the command ship's sensor bay, a junior officer named Preth was not thinking about the 240 ships on the transmission. Preth was thinking about something else. He was young, only 12 years into his service, and he had a habit of looking at things that other people didn't notice. He had been running a passive long-range scan of the solar system since their arrival. Routine work. The kind of scan that looked for debris fields, gravitational anomalies, anything that might interfere with ship movement. Nothing exciting. Except there were mass readings in the outer system that didn't match anything on the charts. Not planets, not large asteroids. The density was wrong. The distribution was wrong. The spacing was too regular. He ran the scan again, then again. He stared at his results for a long time. Then he picked up his comm unit and asked very quietly to speak to the Admiral's operations officer. I think, Preth said very carefully, that we may need to revise our assessment by more than a little. The 30 days passed. On Earth, they were not quiet days. The cities were tense. People watched the sky. News broadcasts ran constant coverage of the fleet above Jupiter. Some people wanted to fight. Some people wanted to surrender. Most people were simply afraid, holding their families close and watching the feeds and hoping that someone, somewhere, knew what they were doing. But in the places that mattered, in the underground command centers, in the military bases, in the shipyards on the moon, and in the asteroid belt, and in the dark cold of the outer system, the days were not quiet either. They were busy, incredibly busy. Ships were finished. Crews were assigned. Weapon systems were tested. Commanders reviewed plans that had been built and refined and updated over decades. Amara Osei spent most of those 30 days in the Geneva bunker, running war councils, reviewing intelligence, and making decisions that she knew would change the course of human history, regardless of how they turned out. She slept 4 hours a night. She ate when someone put food in front of her. She did not let herself think about what would happen if they were wrong about their own strength. On the 29th day, she sent a final message to Grand Admiral Velkos. It was short. We will not surrender. We were not built to kneel. Whatever you bring, we will answer it. Come, if you are coming. Velkos read the message in his command chair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set it aside, turned to his tactical officer, and said, Prepare the fleet for advance. We strike at Earth orbit. He had done this before, many times. He had no doubt about how it would end. But somewhere in the back of his mind, small and quiet, like a sound heard through a wall, was the memory of Preth's scan. The mass readings in the outer system that didn't match anything on the charts. The spacing that was too regular. He had asked for a follow-up scan. The results had been inconclusive. Too much interference from the outer planets. He had filed it away. He had told himself it was nothing. The fleet began to move toward Earth. On the moon, Commander Yara Shen stood at the viewport of the ISS Unbroken and watched the Imperial fleet begin its slow advance on the long-range display. She was 38 years old with short dark hair and the kind of steady eyes that come from spending a lot of time looking at things clearly. She had been a warship commander for 9 years. She had trained for this her whole career, not for some hypothetical war, but for this specific war against this specific kind of enemy. The deep space military program had known for decades that first contact was coming, and that it was unlikely to be friendly. She had believed it, she had prepared for it, and now it was here. Behind her, her crew moved to their stations. Around the moon, the other ships of Earth's first defensive fleet were powering up, running final checks, taking their positions. 180 ships, ready to meet the Empire at Mars. Jarl looked at the advancing fleet on the display. 200 Imperial warships. She knew what they were. She knew how they fought. She had studied them for years. She also knew something that those 200 Imperial ships did not know. She knew this was not even close to all that humanity had. She sat down in her command chair, fastened her harness, and said quietly to her crew, "All stations ready. Let's show them what we're made of." The ISS Unbroken moved out of lunar orbit and joined the fleet. Ahead of them, the Empire was coming. Behind them, the real army was waiting, and the universe was about to learn that humanity had been very, very quiet for a very, very long time. Not because they were afraid, but because they were ready. The Imperial fleet crossed the orbit of Jupiter in perfect formation, 200 warships moving in the tight, disciplined pattern that the Zarvekian military had used for thousands of years. It was a formation built on confidence. Ships lined up in rows, weapons facing forward, shields covering the flanks. It was the kind of formation that said very clearly, "We are not afraid of anything you might do, and we are not trying to hide from you." It had worked against every species the Empire had ever fought. There was no reason in Valkos's mind to change it now. He sat in his command chair on the eternal fist of Zarbek and watched the sensor displays as his fleet moved through the cold darkness between Jupiter and Mars. His officers were calm, his ships were ready, and this was a punitive mission. Strike hard enough to break the humans' will, destroy a few of their cities to prove the point, and wait for the surrender that would come within hours. He expected to be done before the end of the day. The first sign that something was different came when his long-range sensors picked up the human fleet assembling near Mars. "Count?" he asked. 180 ships, Admiral," his sensor officer reported. "Moving to intercept at Mars orbit." Valkos studied the display. 180 ships against his 200. It was bold, I would say. He would give them that. Most species in this situation sent no fleet at all, or sent a small token force, and then retreated. The humans were actually going to fight. He looked at the size readings on the sensor display. The human ships were smaller than his, significantly smaller. The biggest ones were roughly half the size of his mid-range warships. They were fast, though. His sensors were having a little trouble getting exact readings on their speed because of some kind of interference that seemed to be coming from the ships themselves. He noted that. He did not worry about it. "They're outnumbered and outgunned," Commander Zathari said from his right. "This will be short." "Yes," Valkos agreed. "But do not be careless. A cornered species is still dangerous. They may have surprises." Zathari nodded, though the look on his face said he did not really expect any surprises worth worrying about. The two fleets closed on each other across the void between planets. So, Commander Yara Shen watched the Imperial fleet coming on the tactical display of the ISS Unbroken, and felt for just a moment the weight of what was about to happen. 180 human ships against 200 Imperial warships. Those were not good numbers on paper. Every officer in the fleet knew it. But numbers on paper were not the whole story, and every officer in the fleet knew that too. "All ships, this is Shen," she said into the fleet-wide comm channel. Her voice was steady. She had practiced keeping it steady for years. "Remember your assignments. Remember your sectors. Don't fight their battle. Fight ours." A wave of acknowledgments came back from the other ships. She looked at the display one more time. The Imperial fleet was in a straight, tight formation, rows and columns, perfectly organized, moving in a straight line like a fist aimed at the heart of the solar system, beautiful in its way, confident, the formation of a force that had never had to adapt to anything. Yara almost felt sorry for them, almost. "All ships," she said, "scatter formation, now." Grand Admiral Velokas saw it happen and did not understand it. One moment, the human fleet was ahead of him in a loose but readable defensive line. The next moment, every single human ship broke away from that line simultaneously and went in a different direction, not retreating. There was no pattern of retreat in it. They scattered like a handful of stones thrown into the air. Some went up relative to the plane of the solar system. Some went down. Some accelerated hard toward his flanks. Some curved back as if retreating, then turned sharply. Within 30 seconds, and our 180 ships had become 180 separate, individual problems, moving in 180 different directions. "What are they doing?" Sithari said. "I don't know," Valkos admitted, which was not something he said often. "Target the nearest ships. Begin engagement." His fleet's targeting systems went to work. They were excellent systems, the best the Empire had produced in the last 500 years, designed to lock onto enemy vessels and track them through standard evasive maneuvers. They had handled thousands of engagements without difficulty. They had never handled anything like this. The human ships did not evade the way the targeting systems expected. They did not follow smooth curves or predictable escape patterns. They moved in ways that seemed almost random. Sudden direction changes, unexpected accelerations, bursts of speed followed by sharp pivots that should have been mechanically impossible for ships their size. Some of them moved in what appeared to be coordinated pairs, crossing each other's paths in ways that confused the targeting computers about which ship was which. Others moved alone in spiraling, unpredictable paths that shifted every few seconds. Valkos's gunners fired. They hit some targets, but their accuracy, which normally ran above 90%, dropped to something terrible. 30%. 20. Some batteries could barely achieve 10. "Increase power to targeting systems," Valkos ordered. "Admiral," his weapons officer said, with a strange note in his voice. "The targeting interference is coming from the human ships themselves. We're meeting some kind of signal that disrupts our lock-on systems." Valkos absorbed that. "Override it." "We're trying, sir. It's not a simple jamming signal. It's layered. We've never seen this frequency combination before." In the meantime, the human ships were not just evading. They were attacking. They came in from unexpected angles. Never head-on. Never in the ways that made tactical sense by Imperial doctrine, but always from directions that expose gaps in the Imperial formation. They fired, then turned away before his ships could respond. And a group of 6 human ships would converge on a single Imperial vessel from 3 different directions, deliver concentrated fire, and then scatter before his fleet could organize a response. Another group would slip through a gap in his formation, wing attack 2 ships from the inside of the line, and be gone before anyone could box them in. The first Imperial ship went dark 15 minutes into the engagement, then 2 more, then 3, in quick succession, as a group of human vessels caught one of his rear squadrons, still trying to reform after the initial scatter. Valkos stared at the damage reports coming in. He had been in 100 engagements. He had never lost 3 ships in the first half hour. He had never lost 3 ships total in most of the campaigns he had run. They fight like they've been at war with each other their whole existence, his tactical officer said quietly, almost to herself. She was not wrong. That was exactly what it looked like. Maybe every human commander in that fleet was fighting as if the rules of war were something that other people followed, as if the entire concept of a fair, organized battle was a suggestion rather than a law. They attacked when they shouldn't have been close enough to attack. They retreated when they should have pressed advantages. They sacrificed small groups to lure Imperial ships out of position, and then hit those ships from 3 sides while they were exposed. Thousands of years of humans fighting other humans had produced something the Empire had never planned for. Warriors who had no fixed idea of how a battle was supposed to go because they had faced every possible kind of battle already. The engagement lasted 3 hours. In those 3 hours, Valkos lost 43 ships. He sat very still in his command chair, and looked at that number on the display. 43. He had been in a campaign once, years ago, against a species called the Vorath, a fierce, proud civilization that had actually managed to damage several of his ships before they were broken. That campaign, his most difficult in a career of 6 decades, had cost him 11 ships total. 43. The humans had lost 27, more than Valkos would have wanted if they were on his side. But they had not broken. They had not retreated. They had pulled back when they needed to, reorganized in ways that made no sense until they were already happening, and kept coming. Zithari looked pale. The other officers on the bridge were quiet, in a way that had a different quality to it than before. When this was not the quiet of professionals doing their jobs, this was the quiet of people who had seen something they hadn't expected and were still trying to understand what it meant. Options, Valkos said. We press forward, Zithari said, but without his earlier confidence. We still outnumber them. If we concentrate our fire, they won't let us concentrate, the tactical officer said. Every time we try to mass our ships in one area, they pull away and attack somewhere else. They're keeping us spread out on purpose. Valkos knew she was right. He had seen it. Every time he tried to organize his fleet into a concentrated killing formation, the human ships moved in ways that forced him to spread his response. They were controlling the shape of the battle. A smaller, weaker fleet was controlling the shape of his battle. Use the obliteration cannon, Zithari said. The bridge went quiet in a different way. The obliteration cannon was mounted on the heaviest ship in Valkos's fleet, the Unbreakable Will, a dreadnought that sat at the rear of the formation. It was a weapon designed for a specific purpose, ending a battle by threatening something the enemy could not afford to lose. A planet cracker aimed at Earth, charged and ready to fire. It would give the humans a simple choice: stop fighting, or watch their world burn. The Empire had never used it against a space-capable species. It was considered excessive. The point was always to conquer, not to destroy. Dead populations paid no tribute and did no labor. But the Empire had also never had a vanguard fleet, losing 43 ships to a pre-emergent species. Velkus thought about it for a long time, long enough that his officers started to look at each other. Bring the Unbreakable Will forward, he said finally. Target Earth. Don't fire. Give them the visual. Let them see it and make their choice. The dreadnought began to move. On the ISS Unbroken, Yara Shen saw it on the long-range display and said one word into the fleet comm channel. Breaker wing, go. She had known this moment might come. Every commander in the fleet had known. The Empire had planet cracker weapons. It was in the intelligence files, confirmed from multiple sources. The possibility that they would use one in desperation had been in the war plan since the beginning. The breaker wing was the answer to that possibility. 30 ships, small, fast, stripped of everything non-essential to make them faster, had been waiting at the edge of the engagement zone for exactly this moment. Their only job was the dreadnought, nothing else. They had trained for this specific attack run for 2 years. They moved. The Imperial fleet tried to intercept them. Some of the breaker wing ships went down. 1, then 3, then 5, as Imperial fire found them. But the others adjusted, covered each other, pushed through. They did not slow down. Their pilots understood what the dreadnought would do to Earth if they failed, and that understanding removed every instinct for self-preservation and replaced it with something cleaner and colder. They hit the Unbreakable Will from 7 directions simultaneously. The dreadnought was big. It was well armored. It absorbed the first wave of fire and returned it hard, destroying 4 more breaker wing ships in a single volley. But the breaker wing had anticipated this. The second wave came while the dreadnought's weapons were still cycling from the first volley. Then the third wave. Then the fourth. The Unbreakable Will broke. Its reactor went critical 7 minutes after the breaker wing's attack began. The explosion was large enough to show up on Earth-ground telescopes as a new star, brief and brilliant, burning for just a moment before the dark swallowed it again. 11 of the 30 breaker wing ships did not survive. Yara Shen looked at the names of the lost ships on her display for exactly 5 seconds. Then she looked away because she could not afford to stay there, and she said very quietly, "Thank you," to no one in particular. Valkos watched the Unbreakable Will die on his display and said nothing for a long time. He was not the kind of commander who broke under pressure. He had not reached his position in 12,000 years of imperial military history by being the kind of person who fell apart when things went wrong. He was calm. He was analytical. He was professional. But he was honest with himself, sitting in that chair, in a way that he had not had reason to be for a long time. He had lost 43 ships and a dreadnought. His targeting systems were compromised. His formation had been broken, reformed, broken again. His fleet was spread across a region of space twice the size he had planned for. His officers were rattled in a way that would affect performance in a continued engagement, and the humans had not broken. They had not even come close to breaking. Admiral Zithari said, "Your orders?" Valkos looked at the tactical display for a long moment. Then he said something he had never said in 60 years of military service. "Pull back. We withdraw to the outer system." The silence on the bridge was absolute. Admiral Zithari began. "That is my order," Valkos said quietly, clearly. "Execute it." The Imperial fleet turned around. In 60 years, in every campaign, in every engagement he had ever been part of, Valkos had never ordered a retreat. Neither had any other Imperial fleet commander in living memory. The Empire did not retreat. The Empire advanced, or the Empire accepted surrender. Those were the only two options the galaxy had ever offered it. The humans had just added a third. The withdrawal was ordered. The fleet began its long, a slow, deeply humiliating turn, back toward the outer system. And then from a single human destroyer that pulled alongside the eternal fist of Zarbek, at a distance just close enough to communicate, a voice came over the open channel. It was a woman's voice, calm, clear, unhurried. "Grand Admiral." Valkos looked at his communications officer, who confirmed the hail was genuine. He nodded, and the channel opened. "Grand Admiral," the voice said again. "You came with 200 ships. We used 180. You made us work for it. I'll give you that. Your people are disciplined, and your ships are well built." A brief pause. "We have 2,400 more ships. Not here. Elsewhere. Waiting." Another pause. Shorter. "You should tell your emperor what you found here. Tell him this was not our army, but tell him what you saw was the edge of something. Tell him that humanity is not what he thinks we are, and we were never going to kneel." The channel stayed open just a moment longer, and then Euroshan's voice came one last time. Not cold, not angry, but with the quiet weight of something completely certain. "This is only the beginning, Grand Admiral. The real army is coming." The channel closed. Valkos sat in his chair for a long time after the transmission ended. His bridge crew did not speak. The fleet continued its retreat. The blue dot of Earth sat in the distance unchanged, unbroken, small and quiet, and impossibly stubborn in the dark. He began composing his report to the Emperor. He did not know how to write it. He had never written a report like this before. He had to find words for things that had not happened in 12,000 years of imperial history, and he had to find them carefully, because the Emperor was not a being who received bad news with patience. He wrote for 2 hours. He sent the report, and then he sat back and stared at the stars, and thought about the mass readings in the outer system that his junior officer had flagged on the first day. The ones that were too regular, too evenly spaced, too much like ships, sitting very still and very quiet, waiting for an order that hadn't come yet. He thought about that for a long time. Outside the viewport, the stars were silent, but not he, understood now empty. The news reached Zarbek Prime in 7 days. 7 days for the transmission to travel from the edge of the Sol system to the capital world of the Zarbekian Galactic Empire. 7 days for the signal carrying Valkos's report to cross the vast distance between a small blue planet that nobody had taken seriously and the shining ancient seat of the most powerful civilization in the known galaxy. Zarbek Prime was a beautiful world. It had been beautiful for 12,000 years, shaped and sculpted by the will of the Empire into something that looked less like a natural planet and more like a monument to power. Its cities rose in towers of pale stone and glowing metal. Its skies were crossed constantly by the movement of ships arriving and departing from every corner of the empire. Its population of 4 billion citizens lived in comfort and order, governed by laws and traditions so old that no one alive remembered a time before them. The Imperial Senate building sat at the center of the capital city, a structure so large that it had its own weather system inside, its own microclimate of filtered air and controlled light. It had stood for 9,000 years. Wars had been decided in its chambers. Civilizations had been condemned in its halls. Emperors had been crowned beneath its great vaulted ceiling. Nothing that had ever happened inside it had felt quite like what happened on the morning the news from Earth arrived. The Senate session was already in progress when the intelligence director, a tall, silver-haired woman named Director Vorith Sien, walked to the floor and asked for silence. She got it. Something in the way she walked, too carefully, too precisely, on the way people move when they are carrying something very heavy, told every senator in that chamber that what she was about to say was not routine. She stood at the speaker's podium and said, without preamble, Grand Admiral Vel Costas has withdrawn the Vanguard fleet from the Sol system. We have lost 43 warships and 1 dreadnought in an engagement with the human species. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then the chamber erupted. Senators from 400 star systems all began speaking at once. The noise was enormous. Shock, outrage, disbelief, anger, and underneath all of it, the particular kind of fear that powerful people feel when something happens that their power was supposed to prevent. Officials who had not paid any attention to humanity before this moment were suddenly very interested. The historians were already being called. Military advisors were being summoned. Everyone was talking and almost no one was listening. In the middle of all of it, Director Sien stood at the podium and waited. She had more to say. She was going to need them to be quiet to say it. It took a long time for the chamber to settle. The Emperor received the news privately before the Senate session in a room that very few people in the Empire had ever entered. Sovereign Veldarin the Eternal had ruled the Zarvekian Galactic Empire for 400 years. He was not the oldest living being in the Empire. There were some species under imperial rule whose members lived for millennia, but he was one of the most powerful, and he carried 4 centuries of absolute authority in the way he held himself, in the way he looked at things, on in the particular quality of his silence when he chose not to speak. He read Vielkos's report 3 times. Then he set it down on the table in front of him and looked at the wall for a long time. His personal advisor, a quiet, careful being named Sorrel, who had served him for 200 years, sat across the table and waited. 43 ships, the Emperor said at last. Yes, Eternal Majesty. And a dreadnought. Yes, against a pre-emergent species. The Emperor's voice was very flat. Not angry. Not yet. Just flat. The way a surface goes flat before something cracks through it. A species that 14 months ago, our science division classified as having no military threat potential. Yes, Eternal Majesty. The Emperor looked at the report again. He's recommending a full crusade fleet. Yeah, 2,000 ships. His assessment is that the humans have more ships than the initial surveillance indicated, Sorrel said carefully. Significantly more. And that their combat tactics are unlike anything in our historical records. The Emperor stood up and walked to the window. Outside the capital city stretched to the horizon, its towers lit by the morning light of Zarvek Prime's sun. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday and the day before, and for every one of the 400 years he had been alive to see it. The same ordered beauty, the same comfortable certainty. 2,000 ships, he said, assembled and dispatched within 90 days. Yes, Eternal Majesty, it can be done. We have the reserves. And Valkos? Sorrel was quiet for a moment. The Senate will demand accountability. Eternal Majesty. The Emperor nodded. That was how the Empire worked. That was how it had always worked. Victory was rewarded, and failure was punished. And that system had held the Empire together for 12,000 years. He did not enjoy what it required of him sometimes, but the system was the system. Schedule a public session, he said, and send the order for the Crusade fleet. I want 2,000 ships at the Sol system within 90 days. He paused. We will not be embarrassed by this species twice. What happened to Valkos happened publicly because the Empire believed that public accountability kept its commanders honest and its citizens reassured. The session was broadcast to every screen in the Empire. Every world, every station, every ship with a signal receiver watched the Grand Admiral stand before the Imperial Tribunal. He did not argue. He did not make excuses. He stood straight, and he accepted the verdict, and he was stripped of his rank and his commission in front of 4 billion people. Then the Emperor spoke, and his words went to every corner of the Empire. The humans are, or aberration, a temporary problem. The full power of the Empire will correct this within 1 season. The galaxy will see that no species, no matter how stubborn, no matter how lucky, can resist what we will bring. The broadcast ended. The people of the Empire were reassured mostly. Order had been maintained. Someone had been held responsible. The machine was moving again. But in the offices of the Military Science Division, in the analytical chambers of Imperial Intelligence, and when the quiet rooms where the people whose job it was to think about uncomfortable things did their thinking, in all of those places, the reassurance did not quite reach. The analysts had been given all of the battle data from the Sol system engagement. Every sensor reading, every tactical log, every piece of footage from every ship in Valkos fleet. They had been told to understand what happened and to prepare the Crusade fleet commanders for what they would face. They worked in shifts around the clock, and the more they looked at the data, the quieter they became. The human ships were smaller than Imperial vessels, yes, but they were built with a philosophy of construction that Imperial engineers found difficult to immediately understand. There was no single point of failure in the design. When an Imperial ship took critical damage to its main power system, the ship died. When a human ship took equivalent damage, secondary systems came online. Backup power, rerouted functions, redundant controls. Human ships, the analysts concluded, were built by people who expected their ships to take damage and plan for it, who designed for failure as the normal condition rather than the exception. More troubling was the movement data. Imperial combat tactics had been developed over thousands of years and refined through hundreds of campaigns. They were efficient, tested, and almost always successful. Because the species the Empire fought either couldn't match Imperial technology or couldn't match Imperial numbers. Imperial tactics assumed a certain kind of enemy, one that would try to hold a line, protect a position, fight in an organized and predictable way. Humans did not fight that way. The analysts watched the battle footage again and again, and tried to find the pattern. Eventually they found it, and finding it made several of them deeply uneasy. The pattern was that there was no fixed pattern. Each human commander made independent decisions in real time. There was a broad strategy: break the formation, keep the Imperial fleet spread out, hit and run, protect Earth. But within that strategy, individual captains were doing whatever worked in their specific situation, changing their approach constantly as the battle developed. Some of them made decisions that looked like mistakes and turned out to be traps. Some of them made sacrifices, deliberate, calculated sacrifices of their own ships, to create openings that other human ships then used. Yeah, they think differently in a fight than we do. One analyst wrote in her report very carefully, "Not better or worse, differently. They have been fighting each other for their entire history in every possible kind of conflict, and it has produced military minds that treat every engagement as a unique problem to be solved, rather than a known pattern to be executed. This is difficult to plan against, because it cannot be fully predicted." The report was classified above top secret and sent to the Crusade Fleet's high command. Whether they truly understood it was another question. The 90 days began. On Earth, they did not go unnoticed. Humanity's intelligence services, which had been quietly developing their capabilities for decades, out of partly by intercepting Imperial signals, and partly through networks of informants among the species the Empire had conquered, tracked the assembly of the Crusade fleet with grim attention. 2,000 ships drawn from 6 different sectors of the Empire, moving slowly but certainly toward a rendezvous point deep in the outer regions of Imperial space, where they would form up and then make the journey to the Sol system. 90 days. It was both a terrifyingly short amount of time, and for humanity's military planners enough. Because the military planners had plans that had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Plans built over decades, updated constantly, refined by people who had spent their entire careers on a single question: What do we do when the Empire sends everything? And the answer to that question was not a defensive one. Secretary General Amara Osei stood in the Geneva Command Center on the 14th day after the first battle and looked at the assembled faces of Earth's highest military command. "We have 76 days," she said. "Here is what we're going to do with them." Across the galaxy and places the Empire had long since conquered and forgotten about in the way that powerful things forget about small ones, messages were being sent. Not on any channel the Empire monitored, not in any language their systems would flag. The humans had been working on this communications network for years. Quiet signals buried in stellar noise passed through relay points on asteroids and dead moons, and the hulls of mining ships that moved through imperial space, doing ordinary, uninteresting work. Mostly, the messages went to 3 civilizations. The Velhari were an old species, older than the Empire in fact, though the Empire never acknowledged that. They had been conquered 800 years ago and reduced to a labor population working the mines of 3 star systems for imperial tribute. They were quiet and patient people who had survived 8 centuries of occupation by being exactly as unthreatening as they needed to be. The Sandri were smaller, faster, more numerous. A species of gifted engineers who had built some of the most beautiful ships in the galaxy before the Empire came and put their skills to imperial use. Their shipyards now built imperial vessels. Their people lived on rations and worked long shifts, and remembered with careful, guarded anger what they had been before. The Kreth were warriors, or they had been. Kreth, before the Empire broke their military and scattered their people across 30 different labor worlds to prevent them from ever organizing again. Individual Kreth still carried themselves with the dignity of fighters. Their young ones had never been in a real battle, but they trained in secret in the way that a fire kept very small and very careful can survive a long time before it is ready to burn. To all 3 of these peoples, the human message said the same thing. We are fighting. We have pushed the Empire back once. We believe we can do it again, but we cannot do it alone. And we do not want to win this only for ourselves. If you want to fight, not for us, but for yourselves and for your freedom, we are asking. We cannot promise you victory. We can promise you that we will not stop, and that we will not abandon you if you join us, and that if we win, there will be no empire over you, only the stars. The responses took time to come back through the hidden network, but they came. The Velhari elder who responded was named Soreth. He was 230 years old, which for his species was not especially old, but he had lived through enough of imperial rule to know what it meant and what it cost. He composed his response carefully in a small room on a mining world with an imperial patrol passing overhead, as he wrote, "We have waited for a message like this for a long time. We did not know it would come from a species we had never heard of. We did not know you existed until the Empire's fleet turned around. That alone was worth more to us than you can understand. We will come." When the Sandri sent engineers and shipbuilding expertise along with their fighters, they knew the weaknesses of imperial vessel design better than anyone. They had built enough of them. The Kreth sent a message with no words in it at all, just a list of names. Every Kreth of fighting age across 30 worlds who was ready to serve. The list was very long. Amara Osei read all 3 responses in one sitting in the early morning hours when the Geneva Command Center was quiet. She read them carefully, and she did not allow herself to feel the full weight of what they meant. Not yet. Not while there was still work to do, but she sat with them for a moment. Those 3 messages from 3 peoples who had been carrying the weight of imperial rule for centuries and had not broken under it. "All right," she said quietly to no one, "and let's build something worth fighting for." Commander Yara Shen spent the 90 days doing something she had not expected. She spent them teaching. 20 Velhari volunteers had been assigned to her ship and to 3 others in her squadron for cross-training, learning human combat methods, learning to work alongside human crews, building the kind of trust between species that could not be written into a manual, but had to be earned in the daily work of shared purpose. It was not easy. The Velhari were a careful people, precise and methodical, deeply uncomfortable with the kind of improvised, instinctive decision-making that human combat demanded. They had been trained for 800 years to follow rules, to stay in their place, to never act without authorization. Asking them to think independently in a battle situation felt, to many of them, like being asked to run before they had learned to stand. There was friction. There were arguments, misunderstandings, moments of frustration on both sides. Yara had to learn things about Velhari culture that she hadn't known. That direct questions were considered rude. That disagreement was expressed through silence rather than words. That trust was given slowly, and once given was absolute. A Velhari crew member named Teth became the point of connection. He was young, curious, and had a quality that Yara recognized immediately. He watched everything. He studied human crew members, the way a person studies something they have decided to understand completely. He made mistakes, and then didn't make them again. One evening, 3 weeks in, he found her at the observation window after shift. "Commander," he said. "Pop, may I ask something?" "Go ahead. Your people in the battle, the ones who went with the breaker wing." He paused, choosing his words. They knew they might not return. Most of them did, yes. Teth was quiet for a moment. And they went. Yes. Why? Yara thought about it. Not because it was a hard question, but because she wanted to answer it well. Because the alternative, she said finally, was worse than not coming back. Because some things are worth the cost. Because they were human, and humans have always been willing to pay that price for each other. She paused. And for people who aren't human yet, but might be family later. Teth was quiet for a long time after that. He looked out at the stars. "I think," he said slowly, "that I am beginning to understand you." On the 68th day of the 90, an Imperial intelligence agent stationed on a neutral trading station in the Outer Rim intercepted a fragment of a human transmission. The transmission was encrypted at a level the agent had to work for 6 hours to break, and even then, only a fragment came through clearly. The rest was corrupted. The fragment was 11 words. "The frontier fleets are being recalled to the Sol system." The agent stared at those words. The frontier fleets. It was a phrase she had never encountered in any intelligence file, any known database, any intercepted human communication before. It meant nothing to her directly, but something about it. The phrasing, the context, the certainty of it, made the back of her neck feel cold. She flagged it as priority and sent it through the network to Imperial Intelligence Director Scene. The director received it in her office on Zarvek Prime early in the morning. She was a methodical person who had worked in intelligence for 200 years. She did not panic easily. She had read tens of thousands of intercepted transmissions in her career and had learned to distinguish the ones that mattered from the ones that didn't. She read the 11 words 3 times. Then she pulled every piece of data she had on humanity's space program, everything gathered in 14 months of surveillance, plus everything pulled from Vale Cass's battle records, and she started calculating. The math took her 4 hours. When she was done, she sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up her direct line to the Emperor's office. She had never used the direct line before. It was reserved for information that could not wait for a scheduled briefing. When the Emperor's secretary answered, the director said simply, "I need to speak with him now, not later." Now, her voice was controlled, but it was not calm, because the frontier fleets, whatever they were, wherever they had come from, however long they had been out there in the dark being built, crewed, and armed, while the Empire watched the wrong things, were being called home. And humanity, it turned out, had never shown the Empire its real face. Not even close. The Imperial Crusade fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system on the 89th day. 2,000 warships. The largest military force ever assembled in the history of the Zarvekian Galactic Empire. Possibly the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the known galaxy. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a single coordinated wave, filling the outer darkness of the solar system with the light of their engines and the cold shadow of their hulls. They were so many, and they were so large, that the combined light they blocked caused a measurable dimming of the sun's reach at the edge of the system. Fleet worlds had surrendered, just from being told a force like this was coming. Species had laid down whatever weapons they had, and opened their planet's doors before a single shot was ever fired. The sight of the Crusade fleet was supposed to be the end of the conversation. A final, overwhelming argument that no rational being could look at and disagree with. The being in command of this fleet was High Warlord Senax. He was not like Valkos. Valkos had been a careful commander, experienced and methodical, the kind of military mind that wins by preparation and patience. Senax was something different. He was aggressive, direct, and deeply confident in the way that only someone who has never been seriously tested can be. He had won campaigns. Yes, he had broken species and taken worlds. But he had done it the way a hammer breaks a nail, with overwhelming force applied in a straight line. He had read the analyst reports about human combat tactics. He had read Director Scene's urgent message about the frontier fleets. He had considered both of these things and concluded that they were the kind of cautious overcorrections that analysts and intelligence directors produced when they spent too much time reading reports and not enough time understanding what raw power looked like in practice. He had 2,000 ships. The humans had lost 27 in their first engagement. They had started with 180. Even if they had rebuilt, even if they had completed the ships visible in the lunar shipyard transmission, they could not have more than 400 or 500 vessels ready to fight. He outnumbered them 4-1 at minimum. His ships were larger. His weapons were stronger. His crews were trained to imperial standards that had been developed over 12,000 years. This was not a battle. This was a conclusion. He stood at the command window of his flagship, the Emperor's Absolute Will, and looked at the distant dot of the sun at the center of the human system, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a person who already knows how the story ends. "All ships advance," he said. "Standard formation. Way we go to Earth." The human fleet was waiting at the asteroid belt. 600 ships spread across the inner edge of the rock-filled ring that circled the sun between Mars and Jupiter. They were arranged in a wide, layered pattern. Not a single line, not a tight cluster, but a spread formation that covered a huge region of space and forced any attacking fleet to deal with ships coming from multiple directions at once. High Warlord Senek saw the 600 ships on his tactical display and allowed himself a small, cold smile. 600. He had expected more. The analysts had suggested more, but 600 was what was here. And 600 against 2,000 was not a battle. It was a formality. He opened a channel to the entire human fleet, broadcasting on every frequency. He wanted them to hear his voice. He wanted them to understand what was coming, while there was still a moment to choose differently. "People of Earth," he said, and his voice carried the particular tone of someone announcing an obvious fact. "I am High Warlord Senex of the Imperial Crusade Fleet. I have brought 2,000 warships to your solar system. You have 600. I have seen the footage of your first engagement. I know your tactics. I know your tricks. I know how you fight, and I have planned for all of it." He paused, looking at the spread of human ships on his display. "This does not have to end in the destruction of everything you are. Surrender now, and your people will live. Your world will survive. Some of what you have built will be permitted to remain. This is the last offer you will receive. Is this truly all the creatures of Earth can muster?" He waited. The response that came back was not a voice. It was a targeting lock. 600 human ships simultaneously locking their weapons on the leading edge of the Imperial fleet. Senex had expected that. "Advance," he said. "All batteries, open fire." The battle at the asteroid belt was brutal, in a way that the first engagement had not quite been. Senex had studied the human tactics, and he had prepared genuine countermeasures. His fleet did not advance in the rigid, tight formation that Valkos had used. He spread his ships deliberately mirroring the human spread, refusing to give them the dense cluster to pick apart. His targeting systems had been updated with new software, designed to compensate for the interference signals human ships submitted. His commanders had been briefed extensively on the hit-and-run methods humans preferred, and had orders to pursue aggressively rather than hold position. And it worked partially. The human fleet did not have the same easy success they had found in the first battle. Imperial fire was more accurate this time. Imperial ships responded more fluidly to the swarming attacks. The battle was harder for the humans than Mars had been, and they felt it in their losses in the first hour. 14 ships gone, then 20, then 30, as the sheer weight of 2,000 Imperial vessels began to tell. The humans were fighting brilliantly. Even Senex, watching the tactical display, could acknowledge that. Their captains made decisions that his computer still struggled to predict. They used the asteroids as cover, seeing hiding behind rocks the size of small cities, and then emerging from unexpected angles. They created what looked like retreats that turned into ambushes. They coordinated in ways that seemed almost instinctive, small groups of ships working together, with a fluency that suggested they had trained together for years, which of course they had. But they were being pushed back. Slowly, inevitably, the weight of numbers was moving the battle toward its conclusion. The human fleet gave ground carefully, fighting for every kilometer, bleeding the Imperial advance as much as they could. But the asteroid belt was falling behind them. Mars was ahead, and after Mars, Earth. Senex watched his tactical display with growing satisfaction. This was how it was supposed to go. This was the proper order of things. Imperial power, properly applied, on overcoming an obstacle that had gotten too large in some people's imaginations. He would reach Earth orbit within hours. He would aim his most powerful weapons at the surface and transmit a final ultimatum. And this time, with their fleet broken and their planet in his crosshairs, the humans would kneel. He was thinking about the exact wording of his victory transmission when his sensor officer made a sound. It was not a word. It was barely a sound at all. It was the kind of small, involuntary noise that people make when something happens that is too large to immediately process. Too far outside the boundaries of what was expected to produce a normal response. Senex looked up. "Report," he said. The sensor officer was staring at her display. She looked up at him with an expression he had never seen on the face of one of his crew before. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked back at her display as if hoping it had changed. It had not changed. "FTL exits," she said. Her voice was very careful, the voice of someone delivering information that they know will change everything, and are not sure how the person receiving it will react. "Multiple FTL exits, bearing all vectors." "How many?" Senex said. The sensor officer looked at her display again. She ran the count twice. She ran it a third time because the number seemed impossible. "All vectors, sir," she said again. "They are coming from every direction. They came out of faster-than-light travel in waves, not from one direction, not from two or three, from every direction simultaneously, above and below the plane of the solar system, from the inner system and the outer dark, from the direction of the galactic core and the direction of open space." FTL exits bloomed across Senex's tactical display like lights turning on in a city at dusk. 1, then 10, then 50, then hundreds, the numbers climbing so fast that his display system struggled to keep count. These were not the ships from the asteroid belt. These ships were different, larger than the ones he had been fighting, still not as large as Imperial warships, but significantly bigger than the 600-ship fleet that had been bleeding and retreating for the last hour. Their hull designs were similar but not identical, variations on the human template, built in a slightly different style, whereas if they had come from a different place with a slightly different set of tools, which they had. The frontier fleets had been out in the dark for 60 years. They had been built and crewed and armed by generations of humans who had grown up not on Earth, but among the stars, in the asteroid belt, and the outer planets, and eventually beyond the solar system, in the cold and the distance, and the slow, patient work of building an empire that didn't call itself an empire. They had explored and mapped and established presence in 14 star systems beyond humanity's home. They had been the secret that Secretary General Osei had mentioned in her message, the secret that Director Scene had started to piece together too late, the secret that Val Cossett's junior officer had glimpsed in the mass readings on that first day, and not quite understood. There were 3,200 of them, and behind them, coming in on their own FTL signatures in tight formation, were the ships of the allied species, the Velhari, the Sondri, and the Kreth. Ships that were smaller, less armed, crewed by beings who had lived their entire lives under Imperial rule and were flying into battle for the first time in their history, with their own flags on their hulls and their own commanders at their helms. They were not as powerful as the human ships. They had been free for less than 90 days. They were there anyway. The total count settled on Senex's display, and the number sat there, and refused to be anything other than what it was, 4,800 ships, surrounding the Imperial Crusade fleet from every angle. High Warlord Senex did not move for a long time. His bridge was completely silent. The kind of silence that happens not because nothing is being said, but because no one can find words for what they are seeing. His officers stared at their displays. Some of them looked at each other. One very junior sensor technician at the back of the bridge was running the count a fourth time, as if the act of counting again might produce a different number. It did not produce a different number. Senex had 2,000 ships. He was surrounded by 4,800. The 600 ships he had been fighting, the ones he had been pushing back, the ones he had been certain were the measure of humanity's strength, had stopped retreating. They had turned around. Somehow they were rejoining the battle, their hulls still bearing the marks of the last 2 hours of combat, their weapons already retargeting. He understood several things in that moment with perfect clarity. He understood that the human fleet he had been fighting was not the real human fleet. It had been a delaying force, large enough to make the battle feel real, to hold his fleet in place and keep him focused on the fight in front of him, while the walls closed in from every side. The 600 ships had not been fighting to win. They had been fighting to hold him still, while 4,800 ships got into position. He understood that everything he had prepared for, the updated targeting systems, the counter-tactics, the careful study of human methods, had been prepared against the wrong information. Only he had prepared to fight the species that had faced Vel'Koz at Mars. He had not been told what was out in the dark, because no one in Imperial intelligence had known. Director Scene had suspected. The fragment about the frontier fleets had been a warning, but the full scale of it, 14 star systems, 60 years of building, generations of human beings born to the stars and trained to fight among them, had not been in any file anywhere in the Imperial database, because humanity had never shown it to them. And he understood finally and completely something that the analyst reports had tried to say, and that he had not truly heard. The humans had not been preparing for this war because the Empire had sent a fleet. They had been preparing for this war because they had always known someday a fleet would come. They had built for 60 years for an enemy they had never met, against a threat that had never materialized until 14 months ago, because that was the kind of species they were. The kind that looked at the dark and said something is out there, and then got ready. He reached for his comm unit. His first officer, standing 2 paces to his right, said very quietly, "Warlord, what are your orders?" Senex thought about his orders. He thought about what 2,000 ships could do against 4,800. He thought about fighting this battle the way a commander was supposed to think about it. He ran the numbers. He considered the angles. He looked at the tactical picture with the same cold professionalism he had always brought to every engagement. He came to the same conclusion every time. "Initiate a broadcast on all channels," he said at last. "Human command frequency." The channel opened. On the ISS Unbroken, Commander Narration heard the channel request and accepted it. She had been waiting for it. "Commander Shen," Senex said. It was the first time he had addressed her by name. He had learned it from the intelligence files. He had not thought he would need to use it like this. "High Warlord," Narration, a brief silence. "You held back," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of understanding arrived at too late. "Yes," she said. "The 600 ships. They were a trap. They were a door," she said. "We needed you inside the system before the rest arrived. You obliged us?" Another silence. His display was still updating as the Allied ships completed their encirclement. Could the Kreth fighters slotting into position on his port flank, the Sandri engineering vessels hanging back at range, the Velhari ships steady and patient in the formation humanity had taught them. "How long," he said. "How long have you been building this?" 60 years, Narration. "Give or take." Senex absorbed that. "Your people," he said. "They knew this was coming 60 years ago?" "They knew something was coming," Yara said. "They didn't know exactly what or when. They just knew that when it came, they wanted to be ready. That's what humans do, High Warlord. We get ready." He looked at his display one more time. 4,800 ships. The Imperial Crusade fleet surrounded. The largest military force in galactic history, held in place by something larger. "I have 2,000 ships," he said. "Sunar, I will not surrender them without a fight." "I know," Yara said. "I didn't expect you to." The channel closed. What followed was not a battle in the way that Senex had imagined his battles. It was not a contest between two forces with a real question about the outcome. And it was a systematic dismantling carried out with the precision of people who had planned for exactly this moment and were executing the plan. The Imperial fleet fought. They fought hard because they were well-trained professional warriors. And they had their pride. And they had their orders. And some things do not stop being true just because the situation is hopeless. Some ships broke through the encirclement and ran. They were chased and caught by the frontier fleet ships waiting in the outer system. Yes, some formed into tight defensive clusters and sold their ground as dearly as they could. Some simply turned their weapons outward and fired in every direction until there was nothing left to fire with. Senex's flagship was among the last to fall. He fought it to the end, and when the end came, it came quickly. He did not die. The Emperor's absolute will was boarded by a rapid assault team from the ISS Unbroken. Human soldiers in gray armor who moved through the damaged corridors of his ship with the same infuriating, hard-to-predict fluency that his analysts had spent weeks trying to understand. They reached the bridge, secured his command staff, and stood Senax against the wall of his own command room with his hands bound. He looked at the human soldier holding a weapon on him and thought about everything. About the 2,000 ships, about the 43 lost at Mars, about the 14 months of surveillance that had missed 60 years of preparation, about the 4,800 ships that had come from every direction, like the closing of a fist. He thought about the Emperor receiving his report. He thought about what the galaxy would look like after this. A medic checked him for injuries. A soldier offered him water. The human who led the boarding team, a young woman with a calm face and a rank insignia he didn't know how to read, told him in his own language that he was a prisoner of the Earth Defense Force and that he would be treated with respect. He sat against the wall of his captured bridge and thought about how strange that was. Only the Empire took prisoners. But the Empire did not usually begin prisoner interactions by telling the prisoner they would be treated with respect. He filed that away. It felt important, though he didn't yet know why. The battle ended before the day was out. Wreckage drifted through the solar system. The broken remnants of Imperial ships scattered across the space between Mars and the asteroid belt, like the pieces of something that had been very certain of itself and had been proven wrong. Human recovery teams were already moving through the debris looking for survivors in escape pods, cataloging the dead, doing the long and quiet work that comes after the loud work is finished. The Allied ships held their positions steady and real. The Velhari and the Sandri and the Kreth, present in the human solar system, armed their flags on their hulls for the first time in centuries, or forever. Teth, standing at the viewport of the ISS, unbroken beside the berth where he had spent 90 days learning what humans were, looked out at the Velhari ships and said nothing for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "We are here." And Yara, standing beside him, said, "Yes, you are." In the wreckage of the Imperial flagship, among the pieces of the Emperor's absolute will, still tumbling slowly in the dark, an escape pod had launched in the last minutes of the battle. Inside it, High Warlord Senax recorded his final intelligence report on a secure channel, encrypted for the Emperor's eyes alone. He recorded everything: the 4,800 ships, the Allied species, the 60 years of preparation, the tactics, the frontier fleets, a word the way the humans had held the door open and waited for him to walk through it. And at the end, because he was a professional, and because he believed in giving his commanders every piece of information that mattered, he included one more thing: a projection his tactical officer had been running in the last minutes of the battle, before her station went dark. A calculation based on the ship designs he had seen, the construction rates implied by the facilities in the intelligence files, and the output that 60 years of building across 14 star systems could reasonably have produced. The projection said that the 4,800 ships were not humanity's full military strength. They were based on everything the data suggested, approximately 60% of it. Senax recorded that number. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, in the flat voice of a person who has gone past shock into something quieter and colder, "The force that destroyed us was their reserve. Eternal Majesty. The full fleet has not yet been seen. I do not know what they are waiting for. I do not know if they are waiting for anything. He paused. But I believe, with complete certainty, that we have made a very serious mistake. The pod drifted in the dark, its beacon pulsing steadily, carrying its message back toward the Empire. Behind it, in the solar system it had come from, the lights of 4,800 ships burned against the black, steady, unbroken, and very much at home. The real army had arrived, and the galaxy was never going to be the same. Galactic Empire. In shock, this is only the beginning. The real army is coming. Piccone, the Emperor, did not speak for 3 days. This was not unusual in the sense that Sovereign Veldaran the Eternal was known to take long periods of silence when he was thinking deeply about something. He had ruled for 400 years, and in that time he had learned that the most important decisions, the ones that would shape the galaxy for centuries, deserved more than a quick response. He sat in his private chambers in the tall, quiet room where the light came through windows that had stood for 9,000 years, and he read Senex's final report again and again until the words stopped being words and became something else. A shape, a problem, a new reality that had to be understood before it could be answered. On the 4th day, he called his advisor Saral. Saral came quietly as he always did, and then sat across the long table and waited. He had served his emperor for 200 years. He knew when to speak and when to be still. This was a time to be still. The emperor set the report on the table between them. "How did we not know?" he said. His voice was not angry. It was something that was harder to hear than anger. It was genuinely confused. In 400 years, Veldaran had not been genuinely confused very often. How does a single species on a single world in a star system we have been watching build all of this without us seeing it? Sorrel considered the question carefully. He had been considering it for 3 days on his own, in preparation for exactly this moment. "Because we were looking for the wrong things, Eternal Majesty," he said. "When we surveyed a new species, and we looked for technology that matched our own. Ships that look like ships, weapons that look like weapons, military installations that matched what we know military installations look like." He paused. "The humans built everything underground, in the dark side of their moon, in the asteroid belt, in the outer system, in places we didn't scan thoroughly, because we looked at this species and decided they were not worth a thorough scan. We decided they were not a threat," the Emperor said. "Yes, because they were young. Yes, and because they were chaotic. They argued with each other. They had hundreds of languages and dozens of governments. They seemed disorganized." Sorrel paused again. They were disorganized in many ways, but underneath the chaos, they were building quietly, patiently, might with a level of long-term planning that we did not think a species their age was capable of. The Emperor looked at the window. Outside the capital city of Zarbek Prime was very still. The news had reached the public now, not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. People knew the Crusade fleet was gone. 2,000 ships, the largest force ever assembled, destroyed, or captured by a species that 14 months ago had been classified as pre-emergence and non-threatening. The streets were not empty, but they were quiet in a way they had not been in a very long time. "The Senate wants war," the Emperor said. "They are calling for full mobilization. Every reserve fleet, every sector command. Burn the human system to ash and be done with it." Sorrel said nothing. "You disagree," the Emperor said. "I think the Senate is afraid," Sorrel said carefully, "and afraid people want to do something large and final that will make the fear go away. But Senex's last report says the 4,800 ships were only 60% of human strength. If we send everything we have, and they have more waiting somewhere that we don't know about." He let the thought finish itself. The Emperor was quiet for a long time. "Then what do we do?" he said. And for the first time in a very long time, the question was genuine, not rhetorical, not a test of his advisor's thinking. A real question from a being who had just discovered that the galaxy he had ruled for 4 centuries was not the galaxy he thought it was. Saral reached into his robe and placed a single document on the table. "They sent this," he said. Secretary General Osei Pony. It arrived this morning. The Emperor picked it up and read it. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a list of demands. It was not the kind of message the Empire sent when it had won. The kind that said kneel, and pay, and serve. It was something entirely different, and the Emperor read it twice, because the first time through, he was not sure he was reading it correctly. It was an invitation. Secretary General Amara Osei had written the message herself, in the same early morning hours, when the Geneva Command Center was quiet, and she could think without the noise of the world pressing in on her. She had spent 3 days after the battle, doing the same thing the Emperor was doing, sitting with what had happened, understanding it fully before she said anything about it. She had walked through the command center in the quiet hours, and looked at the faces of her staff, and thought about what it meant to have won, and what it meant to do something worthy of the winning. Then she wrote the message. It said in simple language that could not be misread, that humanity did not want the Empire's territory. It said that humanity had not fought this war to become the thing it had fought against. It said that the species the Empire had conquered and enslaved over 12,000 years of expansion deserved to be free. Not because humanity said so, but because freedom was not something one civilization could take from another and call it governance. It said that Earth was willing to talk, willing to negotiate a new order that did not require anyone to kneel, and that the only things humanity was not willing to feel, and the end of the practice of conquest itself. And it said one more thing at the end, in the plainest language she could find. We did not ask for this war. We did not want it. We prepared for it because we understood it was coming, and we survived it because we prepared well. But we are not conquerors. We are not an empire. We are humanity, and we are offering you something your civilization has never offered anyone in 12,000 years. A choice that does not end with chains. Talk to us. That is all we ask. Talk to us and we will listen. The Emperor read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it inside his robe and looked at Saral for a long moment. She is either the most honest leader I have ever encountered, he said slowly, or the most dangerous. Perhaps both, Eternal Majesty, Saral said. The Emperor thought about it for a long time, and then, because 400 years of ruling had given him, among other things, the ability to recognize a door when it was being opened, he said, "Send a response. Tell her we are willing to talk." The talks took place on a neutral station, a small, old facility in the space between two star systems, chosen because it belonged to nobody, and therefore offended nobody. Amara Osei arrived with a small delegation. The imperial representatives arrived with a larger one because the Empire had never quite learned to travel lightly. They sat across a table that was neither imperial design nor human design, but something simpler and older, and then they began. It was not easy. 12,000 years of imperial habit did not change in a single meeting, or 10 meetings, or 50. There were arguments. There were moments when the whole thing nearly collapsed, when an imperial senator said something that landed like a stone thrown through glass, when a human delegate pushed too hard on a point that the Empire was not ready to concede. There were nights when Amara went back to her quarters on the station and sat in the dark and wondered if she was being naive, if the Empire was simply using the talks to buy time while it rebuilt its fleet, if the whole thing was a beautiful mistake. But she kept going back to the table in the morning, and slowly, like a door that has been locked for a very long time, being opened for the first time, things began to move. The Velhari went home first. The mining worlds they had worked for 800 years were returned to them through the first of the agreements. A short document simply worded that said in legal terms what everyone at the table already knew, that the Velhari had been taken from their home system and that they had a right to return to it. Elder Soroth was not there when the first Velhari colony ships crossed back into their home system. He was old, and the journey was long, and his body was not what it had been. But he watched the feed from the observation room on the neutral station where he had been staying as a representative of his people during the talks. He watched the ships land. He watched his people step out onto soil that their great-grandparents had been taken from, onto a world that had been theirs before the Empire came, where he watched them kneel down and put their hands in the dirt the way people do when they are touching something they thought was lost forever. He sat in a chair in the observation room. and said nothing for a very long time. Commander Yara Shen came and sat beside him. She had been at the station for the talks, representing Earth military. She had no official reason to be in the observation room at this moment. She had come anyway. They watched the feed together without speaking. After a while, Sorath said, 800 years. Yes, Yara said. We kept the songs, he said. The songs about the homeworld. We taught them to our children, and they taught them to theirs. And even when the Empire forbade them, we kept them in the quiet. We were afraid one day we would forget what we were singing about. Yara said nothing, and there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than the moment. Sorath looked at her. Your people did not have to do this, he said. You won the war. You could have taken what you wanted and made your own rules. We could have, Yara agreed. Why didn't you? Yara thought about it. About the breaker wing and the 11 ships that didn't come back. About Teth at the viewport saying we are here. About Amara Ose writing a message that offered a choice instead of a chain. Because we've been the losing side before, she said at last. A long time ago. In our own history. On our own world. We know what it feels like to have someone take everything from you and call it the natural order of things. We didn't want to be that. She paused. And because the people on those ships down there are worth more than whatever we could have taken. Sorath looked back at the feed. His people were still landing. There were a lot of them. It would take many ships and many days. I think, he said quietly, that your species is going to be very interesting to know. The Sandri engineers went home to their shipyards and began building again. Their own ships this time, under their own flags, for their own purposes. The designs they produced were unlike anything they had built under Imperial direction. Freed from the requirement to build for Imperial efficiency and Imperial scale, they built things that were smaller, more elegant, and in the opinion of several human engineers who saw the early designs, quite beautiful. The Kreth took longer. Whenever their people were scattered across 30 worlds and gathering them was a slow process. But they gathered, and as they gathered, they remembered what they had been before the Empire came. They did not become what they had been. You cannot step back into a shape that 800 years of pressure has changed, but they found something new that had the bones of the old thing inside it. They sent a delegation to Earth. The delegation spent 6 months there, learning and teaching, and when they went home, they brought with them a word in their own language that roughly translated to ally, and placed it next to a word they had not used in 8 centuries, that roughly translated to free. On Zarvek Prime, the changes were slower and harder and less clean, and the Emperor signed the Galactic Liberation Accord on a gray morning in the Senate chamber, surrounded by senators who had argued about it for months. Some of them signed willingly. Some of them signed because they had looked at the numbers and understood that the alternative to signing was a war they could not win. Some of them signed because 400 years of imperial certainty had cracked enough that something new could get through. And what was getting through felt uncomfortably and unexpectedly like the correct thing. The accord was not perfect. No document written by many different species across a wide table over many months is ever perfect. There were compromises that satisfied nobody completely, and provisions that would be argued about for years. But it said the essential things. It said that conquest was over. We had said that the species the Empire had taken were free. It said that the Empire would remain not destroyed, not dissolved, but changed, bounded. No longer the law of the entire galaxy, but one powerful civilization among several, required for the first time in its history to negotiate rather than dictate. Amara O'Shea signed for Earth. She used a plain pen, the kind anyone could buy in any shop in Geneva, because she wanted there to be nothing ceremonial about her signature. She wrote her name simply and clearly, and set the pen down and looked at what she had just put her name to. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in the particular way that people feel after something very large and very hard is finished. A tired that is also a kind of peace. She thought about all the people who had made this moment possible, the ones who were in this room and the ones who weren't, the ones who had come back from the battle at Mars and the asteroid belt and the ones who had not. She thought about the breaker wing. She thought about them for a long moment in the middle of the crowded historic room, and she was very still. Then she stood up and shook the hand of the Imperial representative across the table. And the room moved on, and the work continued. Yara Shen was back on the ISS Unbroken when the message came in. She was at her desk, doing the ordinary administrative work that ship commanders spend a surprising amount of their time on, when the priority signal chimed on her console. She looked at the header. Oddly, it was from a Frontier Fleet scout, one of the deep-range vessels that operated in the unmapped regions of the galaxy, beyond the areas that even the Empire had charted. Humanity had sent scouts out into that dark a long time ago, quietly and without announcement, because they were the kind of species that could not look at an unexplored place without wanting to know what was in it. She opened the message. It was short. Scout commanders in the deep range didn't write long messages. The transmission cost was too high, and the distance was too far. They said what needed saying, and nothing else. Command, you need to see this. We have detected structures in this region. Artificial, large, unlike anything in any known database. Age estimates place construction at minimum 40,000 years old. There are no life signs currently detectable, but the structures are intact and there are energy readings we cannot explain. There is more. We have picked up long-range observation signals originating from outside the charted galaxy. Something has been watching the solar system. We cannot determine the source. We cannot determine how long they have been watching. We believe they observed the battle, all of it, awaiting orders. Yara read the message twice. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her quarters for a long moment. 40,000 years old, structures intact, something watching from outside the charted galaxy, observing the battle, present and patient, and so far beyond any scale of time that the Empire's 12,000 years of history was recent by comparison. She thought about what that meant. She thought about humanity. Young, loud, stubborn, chaotic, brilliant, costly, impossible, improbable humanity. And the signal it had just sent into the dark. The signal of a species that fought when it needed to fight, and stopped when fighting was done, and built alliances instead of empires, and sent its people out into the unknown, because the unknown was where the interesting things were. She thought about whoever was out there watching. She picked up her comm unit and opened a channel to the Geneva Command Center. It took a moment to connect across the distance. Then Secretary General Osaze's voice came on the line. Calm as always, carrying the particular quality of someone who had weathered very large things and come out the other side still standing. Shen, she said, what do you have? Yara forwarded the scout's message. She waited while Osei read it. She heard the slight change in the quality of the silence on the other end of the line. That meant the Secretary General had finished reading. A long pause. Well, Osei said. Yes, Yara agreed. Another pause, shorter. Your recommendation? Osei said. Yara looked out her viewport at the stars. The same stars she had been looking at her whole life, her whole career. All the years of preparation and training, and fighting, and hoping. The same stars that had always been there, patient and enormous, full of things that nobody had yet found names for. Send more scouts, she said. Go toward it. Find out what it is. She paused. And let them watch. If something out there has been watching us, let them see exactly what we are. Let them see that we fought, and we won, and we stopped. Let them see what we build after. She paused one more time. I'd let them decide what they think about us. Osei was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll authorize the mission. The channel closed. Yara sat in her chair and looked at the stars and felt, very simply and very completely, the size of what was out there. 40,000 years of structure standing in the dark. Something patient and ancient and watchful, sitting at the edge of everything known, observing a small species on a small world in an unremarkable solar system that had just done something apparently worth observing. Humanity was young. The galaxy was old. Whatever was out there was older still. And somehow, impossibly, wonderfully, they were only just getting started. The ISS Unbroken held its position in the Sol system, its running lights steady against the black, its crew going about their work in the warm and busy interior of the ship. Around it, the lights of thousands of other ships, human and Velhari and Sondri and Kreth, burned in the dark like a small city that had appeared from nowhere and intended to stay. The stars did not answer. They never did. But they were there, all of them, in every direction, as far as anything could see and further, waiting. And humanity, as it had always done, was already on its way.